Business leaders face uncertainty and volatility. Non-humans are entering the workplace. Memes control the stock market. And geopolitics is a business concern. Disruption isn't a future concept. It's here. I am Justin Brady, and using 7,000 predictions and 12 major workplace trends from SHRM, you and I will sit down with psychologists, CEOs, scientists, entrepreneurs, and analysts to make sense of it all. This show isn't about the future. It's about actions to take tomorrow. This is Tomorrowist. I'm Justin Brady. 40% of high schoolers, 40%, and they're coming to your workforce, by the way, 40% of high schoolers report persistent feelings of hopelessness. 29% experience poor mental health, and 10% attempted suicide in the past year. At least that's according to the essay that you sent in advance to me, Dr. Andrea Mata of Bright Spot Families. Thank you so much for coming on Tomorrowist.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Justin.
So obviously a little bit of a LinkedIn post that's gaining some attention, and you said you were kind enough to send me an essay you're working on before this, so I appreciate that. But that figure that you cited really stood out to me. And so obviously younger people are entering the workforce right now. I mean, they always are. But you call this a mental health tsunami. So walk me through what that is. Is this going to make an impact on our workplaces right now for executives?
Absolutely. So I think where America is in right now is that we are experiencing a youth mental health crisis. And so what we're seeing a lot of our teenagers and young adults, those Gen Zers, struggling with mental health. And I attribute a lot of it to how they've been raised, the environments that they've been raised in by their parents and schools that they've been in, and the colleges and in the universities. And now as they transition into workplaces, I don't think corporate America is ready for this next generation to come into the workplace.
Yeah, so let me give you a scenario. There is a friend of mine who's retired, and they have been called back from retirement because someone recently joined this workplace, and after a few months, they already took FMLA because of mental health reasons. And so this person who's worked through retirement is now being called back because this individual is taking time off after only a few months. It was too much for this individual. So is this becoming more common, and will this become more common?
It is absolutely becoming more common. So I had a friend who works for a very big financial firm, and they told me that they had a bright mind who was fresh out of college, and within 2 months of this young person joining the firm, they had to leave for 3 months due to a mental health breakdown. And so they took 3 months off after less than 2 months on the job to gain skills and to recuperate and to build themselves back up, build up that mental toughness, and to come back into the workforce. And then as I started preparing this week for this interview, just this week, it was funny. I was joking with one of my clients, and she's mid-20s. And I was like, oh, well, you guys, and like we joke around a lot. And I was like, well, y'all like take mental health days after you make a mistake. And she starts laughing and like kind of like bows her head down. And I was like, what happened? And she's like, my boss told me I wasn't being proactive enough at my job. She's like, so the next day I called in sick. And I was like, and so I think we're starting to see more and more, at least I'm starting to see more and more of this. And I don't think workplaces know what to do to set themselves up for success or these young adults up for success.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a balance to be had, and we'll probably get into that here shortly. But what I'm hearing is, yeah, this is a scenario that's becoming more and more common. I'm old millennial. Some people call me the Oregon Trail generation. I don't have any recollection of this ever happening. I don't know if people were just burying it or what was going on. But are students at risk of learning when things get tough, just quit, or at least quit temporarily? Is this a thing?
I think what's going on is that we're telling them, and I think it started off with good intentions, but with how we're raising them in like schools and colleges and universities is we're telling them, hey, you have all these trauma, even though it's not trauma, it's stressful life events that we've taken and we have now conceptualized as trauma. And we're telling them that they're broken. And then there's this big push with mental health services and destigmatizing, which is good. But then at the same time, we're telling them to take mental health, days and those kind of things. And it's not in the best interest because what they're doing when they're taking the mental health days is they're just laying on their couches and they're scrolling through social media, which just makes their mental health
Hmm.
even worse. They're not learning skills during those mental health days. They're simply just taking the days off.
So they're not using the day off to actually recuperate and learn a lesson or empower themselves. They're using it to make things worse. What you mentioned something really interesting that I think probably perked a lot of executive ears, which is we're labeling things as trauma, which are
Mhm.
not, or they are not trauma. Can you give me some examples and why? Why are we doing this? Where is this coming from?
This has been something that's been going on, I would say, for the last 8 to 10 years. And so trauma from a psychologist standpoint, if we look at the DSM, the book that we use to diagnose individuals, there are 3 things that qualify as trauma. You are in danger of death, you are in danger of serious injury, or you are in danger of experiencing sexual violence against you or hear about something. In the last 8 to 10 years, people have been taking those 3 things, that definition of trauma, and experiencing what's called content creep. And so we're expanding out the definition of trauma so that now your dog dies at 17 years, like your dog is 17 years old, and now that's traumatizing. And that
Hmm.
person has experienced trauma. So we're taking someone that loses a dog from natural kind of things, and then making it comparable to someone who was sexually, violated or someone who was seriously injured. And that's not helpful by any means.
Right. And because of that, leaders don't know how to triage actual trauma, right? They don't know CHROs, ops people, CEOs, leaders, and general managers have no idea. Like, and you can't even ask, is this really trauma? You can't even ask
Right,
people that.
because that's a lawsuit
So-
waiting to happen.
Exactly. And this is the tough spot I think a lot of leaders are in. They want to be caring, most of them. They want to be caring, but they also need to, achieve things in corporate America. We have to achieve results. What are a few other, you mentioned a few symptoms, but what are some of the symptoms of this mental health tsunami that are making their way into workplaces? Like, leaders probably don't see the signs of a mental health issue or a mental health tsunami, but they probably see some of these symptoms in the workplace, like fill in the blank. What are some of the things that are functionally happening in the workplace as a result of this?
So I think another big characteristic is that they tend to be conflict averse. So they want to avoid conflict at all costs. And so they will literally ghost their managers because they have some kind of issue that they need to talk with about to the managers. And instead of like addressing it head on in an adult kind of way, they're just going to ghost them and stop returning their calls. Like I remember, I think it was about 6 months ago, I had a client and they were a high schooler and they didn't want to work at this fast food establishment anymore. And I was like, okay, well, then you go in and you tell them that like you're not going to work anymore and just like take them, like you're quitting and to take you off the schedule. And they're like, no, I'm just not going to answer like their phone calls. And so like the manager's calling repeatedly over and over and over again. And it's making my client more anxious. And I was like, just be direct. And they never did. It's insanity.
You bring up the phone example, which I think is a good one. This just happened to me. And so someone's manager was telling me an individual doesn't even want to return phone calls because they're terrified of what the other person might say. Is this also another symptom of the mental health tsunami, as you call it?
Yes, because I think what's going on is that this is where I think parenting comes in. Parents, because we're having this generation of like helicopter moms where they do everything, or helicopter parents, where they do everything for their kids, they don't expect the kids aren't making appointments. They're not calling people on the phone. They're just moving straight for text. And so they're getting less practice as a teenager calling. Whereas like millennial generation and older, like we had to call and, like, you had, like, the major the super long cords and those kind of things that, like, wrap around and maneuver. But yeah, like, they're not having to make phone calls so much that there's this woman that refers to herself as, like, the phone lady, and I think she charges, like, $450 an hour to teach millennials and Gen Zs how to use a phone.
What?
Yeah, like, just Google it, like, 400
The
I think it's like
phone lady.
450 the
Holy
phone
cow.
lady,
That's insane.
450, $470 an hour to teach people how to use a phone.
So it's not extreme then to assume that this is cutting into productivity and I would dare to say retention of employees. So the big question is, what do we do about it? So how do executives actually achieve results in this kind of environment? Because as you pointed out earlier, if everything's trauma, if everything's elevated to trauma, a heart-feeling executive that really wants to do well by their employees is in a rock and a hard place because they don't want to push too hard if someone's actually experiencing real trauma, but at the same time, their job is to get results, or their boards or their owners or their managers fire them. So what's the fix?
So big picture, I think we need to start creating environments, workplaces that have high expectations with high support. So I think they've been raised in environments that don't really set expectations. The bar has been very, very low for them, but they've had really high support. So we don't want to take away that high support for them, but we do want, because we need productivity, we want those kind of things, we want our businesses to flourish. We want to set those high expectations. So, big picture, corporations, companies need to start setting high expectations within high support. So, I think one way to do this, one step to do it is by looking at our leadership. And I think the first like practical, actionable step that I would suggest is revamping our evaluations, moving from yearly evaluations to 12-week goal cycles so that every quarter you have goals set for all of your employees across 12 weeks instead of yearly evaluations.
That's significant because I see the same thing, which is people almost don't have concrete goals at all. It's almost a constant sliding, moving scale. Does that create a culture of low expectations where maybe the individual, maybe the young person isn't actually at fault? They just don't know what's expected of them.
Yeah, so I think that's where we have to really come up with behavioral expectations. So you want to, in these goals, you want them to know exactly what is expected of them. What are the actions that they should be taking within these 12 weeks? Now, the other thing with 12 weeks is it gives us that sense of urgency that we don't
Oh,
get when we do 12-month goals. Because it's like, I mean, I was a college professor for 9 years. It's like you give these like students, you're like, hey, you have a paper due at the end of the semester. They don't start working on it until the night before, and they'll pull an all nighter. And so then that's when I started to work in where it's like, hey, your annotated bibliography is due this day. Hey, your first draft is due this day. All of these things. So like that 12 weeks makes them feel that urgency that many of them are lacking instead of that year evaluation.
yeah. And in a culture that's like kind of conflict averse and responsibility averse, this pushes
Mhm.
back on that a little bit. By the way, just a side note, I didn't think that you professors knew we did that. This is news to me. I thought I was getting away. I thought I was actually getting
Well,
away with it.
I mean, I had a strong relationships with my students, so they would literally tell me, and I would tell them, like, "Don't do this." And then I had to just revamp. I had to revamp my course. I had to revamp the environment to set my students up for success.
Yeah, and so one of the things you also talk about in that piece is revamping internal communication. and how there is a lack of internal communication right now. And that's one of the things we can change to prepare students for success. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I remember my husband is a project manager, and so he's worked with some pretty big corporations, some companies over ever since I've known him, so 15 years. And I remember there's this one, and it was right during or right after COVID, and he was struggling to get like his 90 employees to do what he needed them to do. And I was like, dude, you're literally making parts. They're making parts that go into rocket ships, that go into space. I was like, print out, like, how cool is that? I'm like, print out pictures or diagrams of where their part is going and put them by their stations so that they know that the role that they are playing is making a contribution to freaking rockets going into space.
Right. And so do you strengthen, like, is this a newsletter kind of thing? Is this a manager to manager kind of thing, or manager to team kind of thing? Like, expand a little bit what internal communication looks like and how we can improve that and how that's connected to mental health.
So I think tapping it into one thing is sharing the vision. So like telling people on a regular basis, this is our vision, this is where we're going, from the top all the way down. Everybody knows what the vision is. They all know what roles they are playing. Like when I coach high school football players, I tell our head coach, I'm like, every single person on this 83-man roster needs to know what role they are playing in the bigger vision. And then the other tip I would say is like having these dynamic town halls. So this generation loves to feel like they have a say in what is going on. So, but like they don't want to just be talked at, they want to be involved in it. And so allowing like these more dynamic town halls where you're having, panels and Q&As and discussions and dynamic speakers and those kind of things that bring people in and allow you to share insights and thoughts for lots of people instead of just, I'm going to talk at you, but you're inviting them in.
And I want to go back a little bit to what you said earlier, because I think this has impact. But you mentioned phone skills, the phone lady, which I think is hilarious. And maybe I got a little sidetracked because I thought that's funny. But should we be teaching people basic life skills like this? We had another guest here on Tomorrowist, and they were mentioning common sense isn't common. Like the people coming into your workforce don't actually know the stuff you think they should know. So should we be teaching really basic life skills like how to answer a phone or some other things?
And yeah, so that's actually my third step that I suggested was like teaching life skills. So yeah, like we could, the older generations can be like, they should already know these life skills. But the truth of the matter is they don't have these life skills. Like I cannot tell you the number of clients that don't order their own food or drinks at restaurants because their parents still do it for them. I'm talking teenagers and college students that don't do this. And so like if you think they already have this life skill, chances are they don't. And so bringing in and really pouring into them and developing both their professional skills and their life skills would do amazing for their mental health, their personal lives, and for productivity retention.
Yeah, and I want to end on one last thought here, which is what to avoid. Because from the piece, there are some solutions being pushed to executives right now. I've heard a few. I'm not going to call people out. But there are some and this is actually where this started because they're with you and why I reached out on the show, because there were some solutions I was hearing in your space. And I'm like, hey, I'm not the expert here, but some of this stuff sounds really maybe verging on dangerous, and it's being pushed to executives with like a happy face. Are there any things like final point that executives should like run like hell to get away from?
I'm probably gonna get a lot of flack for this, but anything that's like trauma informed, whatever after that. So again, like going back to our earlier conversation, Justin, we've really kind of increased or broaden our definition of trauma, which is not good because then everyone thinks that they're broken. We don't want that. We want to incorporate programming that's going to coach them how to have life skills, professional skills, personal skills, not ones that are just simply going to validate their feelings because their feelings have been validated for far too long and we've ignored their behaviors. We need to start, okay, yes, we know that you have feelings. Feelings are important, but at the end of the day, these are the actions that we need you to be doing for both your best life and for the company's well-being.
Yeah, real quick follow up. So if we're normalizing that and we're normalizing trauma, I don't know if that's the right term. I don't want to, make anybody upset, but is there, maybe I should ask this in a question. Do we risk normalizing trauma? Is this one of the risks you're seeing? And people are like, oh, this is just who I am. I'm just miserable all the time. I can't be fixed. Is this kind of what we're pushing right now?
To some extent, it's like you hear like mental health is not bad and we're trying to destigmatize mental health. But at the same time, like we want people to have enough of a push where like they don't want to be like that. Because so many people think that, well, this is how I'm just supposed to be. I just have anxiety. But the truth of the matter is, you come see me for therapy, your anxiety is going to be gone within 4 to 6 months because we're going to be working together to make sure that you are developing coping skills to tackle that anxiety and to diminish that anxiety. You just have to learn and be willing to learn the skills and actually use the skills.
So bottom line here is set high expectations, and in doing so, set hope and set your employees up for success.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Andrea Mata of Bright Spot Families, thank you so much for coming on Tomorrowist.
Thank you for having me.
Before we say goodbye, I encourage you to subscribe to Tomorrowist wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all our episodes at shrm.org/Tomorrowist, and while you're there, sign up for our weekly newsletter. Thanks for listening, and remember, the workplace is changing rapidly. You don't have time to be a futurist. Be a Tomorrowist.
SHRM.